I'm Kat.
I'm Arden 13.
Welcome to our show, World Tiger.
Building Dragon.
Today we are continuing with our world building basics, talking all about maps.
This time focusing more about cities and dungeon maps. If you wanted to check out our world building video about world maps, you can check the last one, link somewhere in the description or in a card. You can find it.
We have a lot to discuss, so let's get started.
Let's do this. So, we are back talking about map making, again, specifically about cities and dungeon maps. These are generally on the smaller scale, but we wanted to hit some main points from last video that are reoccurrent this time around. First and foremost, the medium is effectively whatever you want it to be. Whatever you choose to use as a medium for creating your map is totally fine.
Random generators also are really awesome for this kind of process. There are plenty of sites out there that will give you city maps at the click of a button, and takes a lot of pressure off of you.
There's also generators out there that give you dungeon maps at the click of a button, and what's even cooler is specifically with such programs as Donjon, they give you the dungeon map plus everything else that is in the dungeon. So simple, so easy. All you really have to do if you want to make it your own is just make some slight modifications.
Another point to remember is figuring out the known world versus the unknown world. Now, when you're dealing with city maps, generally most of it is known. The exception would be if you're doing an underground city or a relatively unknown place to wherever you're exploring. As far as unknown world, dungeons, pretty unknown. Unless they're like a well-traversed path, people won't know too much about them.
That's generally where you try to incorporate such things as the fog of war or dungeon fog, something of the like, some nomenclature.
Where you want to start in your world is pretty much the best place to start. So if you want to start with just a small tavern or an inn, there you go. That's your best place to start. It's also a good point to maybe start small. Maybe don't start off building out an entire city just within a day. Start off with maybe a small town, or maybe just a hamlet.
Or if you are trying to build the large city scale, perhaps it's for a campaign that you're coming up on, perhaps it's for a book that you're writing, the best place to start with key locations that your players or characters would interact with the most. And from there, the rest of the city can just sprawl out.
Well, now that we've talked about the bare minimum of the basics, let's talk about making your city map.
When we talk about scale in your cities, we have to understand that there is a difference between 4 houses and an outhouse and then the sprawling metropolis. So we have some words to go along with that and a little bit of kind of explanation of what you may find in these specific locations. So the first and foremost, the smallest city center, quote unquote, would be considered a hamlet. This is something that these people really are kind of just like scraping by. They have enough to get by, but they don't have a whole lot of amenities that a traveling party, an adventuring party, or what have you, may be able to utilize other than information. Next we have a village that is a little bit bigger, and they have a little bit more to keep themselves going, so they are able to supply themselves with a general store, have a little bit more commerce with the common folk and the people that are passing through. After this is a town, and these are much larger than villages, probably 2 to 3 villages smashed together, but they have multiple centers of work. They probably have some guilds or some trained craftsmen that really kind of set themselves apart to not just be a blink or you'll miss it on the road, but really just a stop, stay there for maybe a night or two, get some things done, and then move on to the city. The city is the largest body of this, the largest scale of these creations, and they are your sprawling metropolis with multiple craftsmen, multiple things, facets, boroughs, neighborhoods, all of the dynamic moving parts that create a city.
If you're looking for more specifics on what the difference between like a village and a town would be as far as people, amenities, things like that, I know the Dungeon Master's Guide, I think page 17, I'll put the actual number here, it kind of has a breakdown of this is how many people would be expected to be in a village, and this is who would be ruling in a village, and things like that. So it really helps with that breakdown of understanding how a village would meet a town and how a town would compare to a city and things like that. With cities having the most people in it and being the most complex group of all of the options that we just listed, it might be better to find ways to split up your city. So create different districts, each with their different purposes. So you've got your commerce district, you've got your craftsman district, you have more of the port harbor area, so that when you're world building, you don't get completely overwhelmed with, oh my gosh, I have this sprawling layout of buildings and people that live here. What do I do? Finding ways to easily kind of break it up, that way you can kind of focus on one section at a time. It's also important to remember that because cities are so big, they grow and they age. So certain sections of your city might be a little older, or the buildings might be brand new in a brand new section of the city. I guess it just depends on what you want.
And my recommendation, if you're one of those people that has to like think of it very straightforward, you can start with the idea of building a hamlet, 4 to 5 houses, but that hamlet is within a village, and that village is within a town, and that town is within a city, and there you've already built out 3 different facets of that city itself. Might be a little bit out there, but just a concept to play around with. Generally, cities are built in one of 2 ways. There is either the freeform style, which was kind of the understood style of how you're going to build a city through the classical age up until the industrial-ish age, and then after the industrial age we get into more of the grid style maps. And the grid style maps, the reason why these things happen is more or less for ease of access, ease of transport, and ease of layout and organization. Whereas freeform maps more or less relied on sectioning things off into districts, boroughs, and neighborhoods, more or less kind of what we just mentioned. Now, I have mentioned that freeform cities are generally pre-industrial period and back to the classical age. I understand that there are cultures that put their cities into grids.
Oh, yeah.
I do believe the Aztecs did that.
They had a system.
They had a system, and it was like clockwork.
Yep.
It worked perfectly. So, if that is something that you wanted to do, don't feel that if you are creating a strictly high fantasy setting, you can't have a grid city style map layout. You can have the freeform with the grid style, or you can just have grid style if that is more confident and more easy for you. Don't feel obligated to stick to one way or the other.
The next point when making your own city maps is considering what is needed for your city. And this could be for a city or for just a hamlet. Maybe your players or your characters in the book you're writing really need a place where they can just rest. Well, then they'll probably just need a small town or maybe even a village, just something to relax in. But if they're looking for contacts, magical items, a wealth of places, of people and places to be at, then they'll probably need a city. So it's important to ask, if you're playing a tabletop role-playing game, ask your players, what are they interested in? What are they looking for? That way, you can kind of cater some aspects of your city to them. It can also be, how does this city or this place that they're about to visit push them in the right direction, taking them from this point A of the city that they're in to their next destination.
If you had players who they're on the road, they're approaching a town or something of the like, but they wanted to do all these different things, talk to contacts, find magical items, and so on and so forth. But in your original idea, this town was actually going to be kind of just like a village, like they would have a rest stop or something like that. Maybe that is an instance for you to say, well, here, let me put in a few more buildings to like diversify, and now it is no longer a village, it is actually a town. It has a few more amenities to cater to the players. Or you can make that known, actually, you guys are only coming up on a little hamlet or something like that, something very small. They're not going to be able to cater to you, but that is something that you're going to want to look at to the next time that you're in the city or in a larger settlement.
Exactly.
Settlement is the word that I should have been using this entire time.
Yeah.
We're recording everything again.
No! Another point for making your settlements is you don't have to have a story for every building. I definitely ran into this problem a couple times when I was building out one of my cities, and that I wanted to find a way to make every building unique, have its own story, its own family, and that is just way too overwhelming. You might be able to do that with your hamlets or maybe your small villages, maybe in towns, but cities, they're just far too big. So
there's so many structures in a city whatsoever. To try to come up with a story for every single one of them is a little bit ludicrous, and if you are intending on creating this city that is super dynamic with all these different stories behind all these different buildings in a much larger world, A, I tip my hat to you for the attempt, but B, do yourself a favor, maybe take a step back, choose just a handful of them, maybe like 3 or 4, and then once you get a little bit more comfortable, then you can start putting in a few more of the stories here and there as you so see fit. Try not to bite off more than you can chew, especially when it comes to cities.
Mm-hmm. This is where it really becomes useful when you have in your cities these distinct energies from each district or section of that city. That way you can come up with, like, you see an inn, and this is the title of the inn, and you see a tavern, and this is the title of the tavern. This is what everything looks like in this district. That way, everything else can kind of be filled in by your players' or your readers' imagination. You don't have to describe every building if you kind of already give a feel or an energy to the district that they're in. Something that I really employed when I was working on Theatrum and I made a city called Estermary was when my players entered into the city, they found someone who would, guide them through the city and teach them kind of the layout of the city. And they were told, oh, we need a place to stay for the night. And so I gave them 3 options for an inn. I gave them a high-end inn that was, like, super expensive, way out of their price range. I gave them a medium, like, good middle ground adventurers inn.
A Hilton.
And then I gave them, like, the grossest, grimiest, cheapest inn possible. That way there's still that illusion of choice, and they can still pick where they want to stay for the night, but I don't have to flesh out 7 to 10 different inns that are within this city.
Let's say your players want to find a magic shop, but they're in a city that has these 3 distinct economic situations. A poor, a moderate, and then a wealthy area. All 3 of them have magic shops. The degree and uniqueness, the rarity of the magic item that they will find can also kind of lend itself to what part of the city that they're in. When it comes to world building, Kat and I have been giving you a lot of questions to ask yourself in this process that you are experimenting with. So, one thing, again, we want to reiterate that you can fall back on when it comes to building your city is page 16 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. It has a great wealth of questions, some of which our favorites are...
What temples and other organizations are featured prominently? What fantastic elements distinguish it from another town? Why should the characters care about this settlement? And I think who governs it and who else holds the power.
That's a big one for me.
Yeah. So these questions can just really help you think more about why is the settlement here, what's its purpose, and kind of give you more places to flesh out your settlement.
Starting with dungeon maps can have little to no connective tissue. Their scale doesn't necessarily matter. They can be small, they can be large, but there's nothing really holding them all together besides the fact that it is a dungeon, it is a continuous thing for a specific thing, and at some point it ends. Obviously, Undermountain is the exception to every single rule we're about to lay down. We're not getting into it. Don't ask me about Undermountain.
When you're building out some of your dungeons, it's really important to remember what was the original purpose of this tunnel or dungeon or whatever you're creating.
The tomb, was it a tomb?
Was it a tomb? Was it a goblin's den? Maybe a mine shaft? The tunnel to a purple worm? A naturally occurring cave? Maybe it was a naturally occurring cave and then it was terraformed and repurposed by a group of bandits. This kind of questioning of where the dungeon came from and what was its original purpose or newer purpose can really help you create the look of it, as well as any traps, treasure encounters that might happen. If you're in a purple worm tunnel, you're not gonna find a trap that the door is just gonna fall out from underneath you because the purple worm's not gonna set that up unless a group of bandits had been there beforehand. So it's important to just remember where did this dungeon come from, and that can help you build out encounters, traps, treasures, things like that.
If you're creating a dungeon for an RPG or a novel, it is always really important or really satisfying to the players or the characters or the readers that each member of the party is able to shine and showcase their own specific talents in whatever problems of the dungeon they encounter, or specific rooms in the dungeon they encounter. An example we have is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone or the Sorcerer's Stone, depending on what side of the Prime Meridian you're on. In that instance, the 3 kids are going through the dungeon, quote-unquote, and each of them get to showcase their talents. Hermione gets the vines, Ron gets the game of chess, and Harry gets to fly around on his broomstick and act cool. One thing I want to make abundantly clear, though, and make it as bold as possible, just because you are creating a dungeon, does not mean that every room has to be combat encounters. Encounters can be anything. They can be combat, they can be puzzles, they can be riddles, they can be feats of strength, they can be really anything that you want them to be.
They can be a role-playing moment, maybe. A moment where they just have to talk and discuss, or find a way to talk their way into the dungeon, or talk their way out of the dungeon. This is definitely not a necessity when talking about building out your dungeons, but it is just something nice that if you can subtly work it into some of your dungeons where, you know, oh, I know this player or this person really likes doing riddles, so I'm just gonna add one in without being like, hello player, this room is for you, you know, just adding it in subtly, just being like, oh yeah, you can't hit your sword hard enough out of this dungeon, you have to be smart. Having that worked into your game just a little bit really, as a player, can make it feel like you're working towards your strengths and you're working towards things that you enjoy and that you like. So while we're wrapping up dungeon maps, I did a little bit of research on what other people's advice would be when you're creating your dungeon maps. So I came across this website called roleplayingtips.com, and I'll put them in the description below because they have some really cool content that I didn't get to explore all the way. But they have a 5-room dungeon format. So this is just a quick and easy, how do you build out a dungeon that won't grow stale every time. It's a little bit different. You can switch things around, but it's just a nice box format. Yeah, template. That's the word I was looking for.
Got you.
So the first room that they have is an entrance or a guardian. So this can be anything from a hidden door to someone that's standing in front of the door saying, no, I won't let you in, anything along those lines. Room 2 is a puzzle or role-playing challenge. So there you go. It doesn't have to be a combat. It can be more of a puzzle or a trap. Not a trap, because the third one was going to be a trick, trap, or setback. So maybe your players have to go back to the entrance, or they are tricked into doing something. Fourth room would be the climax, big battle, or conflict. So most of the time at the end of the dungeons, you're going to find the goblin horde, you're going to find the dragon, you're going to find the lich that's hiding behind the rock, ready to just zap you. Room 5 is going to be the plot twist or the success. Room 5 is going to be either there was no treasure there whatsoever, or here is your big treasure hoard that you get to drag home to your newly world-built city.
Let's talk about your first marks. It can be very daunting if you're just looking at a massive white sheet of paper and you don't know where necessarily to start. My recommendation, use graph paper for cities or dungeon maps. Generally, I want to find a key location, like what we mentioned earlier, that the players will be interacting with the most. This is a tavern, this is City Hall, this is maybe a barracks, maybe even a gate, maybe even a general goods store. One of these locations, mark that on the map, and from there, start to spread out. And here's one of the cool things about making it on graph paper. You can kind of understand with the way that battle mats work that how many squares equals how many feet of space that a person can walk, so you kind of start to get an idea of how big this city, this epicenter is, depending on how far away you create these different buildings. If you create them in the same block, you build them in the same block. Not that big of a deal. Mm-hmm. With dungeon maps, I recommend either starting with the beginning, the open door, secret door, closed door, guardian, the front door, or the end goal. Put that somewhere in the map, put either of those somewhere in the map, and then just build from there.
Mm-hmm. I like working from the end. So working from that treasure hoard outwards. Like, okay, if I was the dragon trying to take care of this hoard, what tunnels or how would I operate to make sure that it's as hard as possible to get to this place? Mm-hmm. So, but if you're working from a purple worm tunnel or a goblin tunnel where they're just kind of chipping away at the stone and hoping for best, you might start from the beginning.
One thing that I do when it comes to my dungeons, when I pre-generate them specifically, I use the program for Donjon, and that just gives you a sprawling dungeon with a series of rooms that have monsters or treasure or nothing at all.
Or traps.
They also include traps. You're absolutely correct. One thing that I do, because there's never a point in those pre-generated dungeon maps that say this is the boss room, is I try to find which is the boss room. I find like a stairwell that they normally generate in there and say, okay, so this is where they're going to start. And then I try to map out and figure out where exactly the party is going, taking doors away, taking hallways away, or whatever that I don't necessarily need or want to if I'm going to draw it and transpose it onto a battle mat for my players to use. Just a tip, throwing it out there. One thing I wanted to drive home with that point is the fact that using generators is very, very helpful. In all of world building, you shouldn't feel ashamed for doing it, but especially in city generation. If you want to go so far as to draw your entire world map and it is exactly to your specification, more power to you. If you want to do that for your cities and your dungeons, again, more power to you. But sometimes it is super helpful to just generate a city, and when your players ask, okay, so what does this city look like? What am I dealing with? And you can just turn your computer screen around and say, this is what you're dealing with, this is where you enter, this is you kind of get a sense of what the city layout looks like and what they can interact with. Super helpful, super exciting. Don't feel ashamed to do pre-generated stuff, if that helps you. And make it your own. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let us know in the comments below something you enjoyed about today's video, or if you have an idea that you're willing to share.
At this point, we've covered a lot of the world building basics, but if you have any additional questions, let us know in the comments below, that way we can cover it in another video.
And speaking of another video, next time we plan on entering into sort of a practicum, us actually sitting down and just world building. Again, we're going to try to keep it shorter than last year's videos, but at the same time we're going to be answering many of the basic questions in a brand new world that neither of us have thought about up until that point. So we'll see what comes up.
Right. Make sure you hit the notification bell and any of the other buttons that everyone else spoke to you about. We would love for you to join our lunch table, but I've been Kat.
I've been Arden 13. I'm still waiting on that ramen.
We'll see you next time. Bye!